The new GPU onslaught continues, with NVIDIA releasing its newest card, the RTX 5070 Ti. Following closely on the heels of the 5080, this new card promises to bring better value with very similar performance for a lower price tag. Did NVIDIA accomplish what it set out to do? And when looking at the partner cards, is there a clear best option for you? Let's find out. Let's take a look at the partner cards. First up is the Galax GeForce RTX 5070 Ti one-click OC in white. This all-white card with its triple fan design measures at 30 centimeters by 12.5 centimeters and comes in at 1,300 grams. The cooler is 50 millimeters wide, so taking up 3 slots, and comes with an RGB header so that you can synchronize the lights on the card with the rest of your components. Next up is our first MSI card, the MSI GeForce RTX 5070 Ti Ventus 3X OC. This card comes in at the same 30 centimeters long as the Galax, though it is a little bit shorter at 12 centimeters, and is our lightest card at 1,060 grams. It measures in at 49 millimeters wide, so requiring 3 slots. And if you are looking for a card without RGB lights, you can get that with the Ventus. Next up is the Palit GeForce RTX 5070 Ti GameRock OC. And if you've seen any of our latest reviews, this card should look very familiar. This iridescent card changes colors based on the angle you look at it, and is pretty chunky at 33 centimeters long, 15 centimeters high, and is the heaviest card we're testing today at 2,168 grams. It also requires a full 4 slots in your case, so plan accordingly. But this card does support dual BIOS and has an RGB header for controlling the RGB lights. Next up is the MSI GeForce RTX 5070 Ti Gaming Trio OC+. This card measures 34 by 14 centimeters, weighs 1,301 grams, is 50 millimeters wide, so requires 3 slots, has a switch to go between its 2 BIOS options, and has RGB lights. Up next is the ASUS GeForce RTX 5070 Ti Tough OC. This card should also look pretty familiar if you've watched those other videos, and measures 33 centimeters long, 14 centimeters high, and weighs in at 1,616 grams. This card measures in at 63 millimeters wide, so requiring 3 slots, and yes, we did test something in the 4th slot just to be sure. Is the only card to offer 2 HDMI ports, while also having a switch to go between its 2 BIOS options, and does have RGB lights in the corner of the card. Last up is another MSI card, the MSI GeForce RTX 5070 Ti Vanguard OC. This card is physically the biggest of all the cards we've tested at 35 centimeters long, 15 centimeters high, though not quite the heaviest at 1,937 grams. You'll also need to make sure you have 4 slots free in your case to fit this, but it does have RGB lights and dual BIOS. And taking a quick look at our test system, we're using an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D paired with an MSI X870E Carbon. We're also using 32 GB of DDR5 6200 memory from Thermaltake, and Windows 11 with the latest press driver from NVIDIA. And starting off the performance results with 4K, this gives all the cards their best opportunity to showcase their performance gains by minimizing the chance that there are any CPU bottlenecks. And since there's not a Founders Edition model available, the Galax RTX 5070 Ti one-click OC will be the benchmark for 100%. And we can see that that card is effectively tied with the RTX 4080. With its namesake from last generation, the RTX 4070 Ti only delivering 78% of its performance, and the 4070 Ti Super delivering 86%. But how do these cards compare against each other? All the cards are pretty close to each other, delivering very similar performance to the RTX 4080 Super and the RX 7900 XTX. The fastest card out of the box is the Palit RTX 5070 Ti GameRock, being 2% faster than the baseline Galax model, with the MSI Vanguard, ASUS Tough, MSI Ventus, and MSI Gaming Trio all delivering very similar performance. One quick thing to note is that we do test all cards as the manufacturer recommends. That means the Ventus and the Gaming Trio are both using their quiet BIOS, so there would be a tiny performance uptick if you switched over into the gaming BIOS. So how does it compare to the faster RTX models? Well, its bigger brother, the RTX 5080, is about 15% faster, which is smaller than in previous generations, and it's more like comparing the 4080 to a 4070 Ti Super. This smaller performance delta and the relatively immature drivers for both these cards did mean we did find a few examples where the 5070 Ti was tied or even slightly faster than the 5080, though that shouldn't be the case in the long term once they all get the same updates. And rounding out the list, the RTX 4090 is 30% faster than the 5070 Ti reference, with the RTX 5090 being 76% faster. Focusing on the differences between the 5070 Ti and the 5080, when looking at the average FPS, both cards deliver under 100 FPS at 4K, so a very similar experience, with all the 5070 Ti cards delivering roughly 85 FPS. Dropping down the resolution to 1440p doesn't really produce any surprises. This should be very similar performance to what you would get if you use DLSS or FSR quality modes when gaming at a 4K resolution. This does make the 5070 Ti models a little more clustered together, and the RTX 4080 now being ever so slightly faster, with the RX 7900 XTX being basically tied. That means they also lost a little bit of ground on the RTX 4080 Super, though they did gain ground on the RTX 5080, which is now just 13% faster. This performance delta between the 5080 and the 5070 Ti does remain basically the same when looking at the 1% lows, though the older cards do handle dips in performance a little bit better, with the RTX 5080, RX 7900 XTX, and RTX 4080 Super all delivering a slightly smoother experience. Dropping down to 1080p would give you a nice boost in performance, and should be about the same performance you'd get when using the performance preset when upscaling to 4K. Moving down to this lower resolution does allow our 5070 Ti representative to surpass the RX 7900 XTX, though just by 1%, and the RTX 4070 Ti Super and RTX 4070 Ti do gain some ground, being 91% and 87% as fast respectively. All the partner cards we've tested did deliver very similar performance, with the Palit Game Rock being technically the fastest card in this test at 1% faster. That does mean the RTX 4080 Super and Vanilla 4080 are a bit faster than the fastest 5070 Ti models, though at least it did gain some ground on the RTX 5080, which is only 10% faster now, and even the RTX 5090 running into some severe CPU bottlenecks, being only 36% faster. Enabling ray tracing doesn't really affect any of the rankings for the Nvidia cards, though the last generation cards seem to do just a bit better than the 5070 Ti, with both the 4070 and 4080 lineup gaining a percentage point, with the RTX 5080 staying right where it was at 10% faster. With each new generation of GPUs, we're always expecting a drop in power consumption or a bump in efficiency. And while it might not be what we would normally call a generational leap, most of the cards tested do use less power than the RTX 4070 Ti Super, while also delivering better performance. The MSI RTX 5070 Ti Gaming Trio did use the least amount of power while gaming, using only 268 watts. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have the Palit Game Rock at 292 watts. And while that is an increase of only 24 watts, that does mean it uses more power than the RTX 4080 Super, which is normally a bit faster, and only 4 watts less than the RTX 5080 at 296, which is always faster. Still, that's not too bad of a result, especially if you compare it to the AMD equivalent, with the RX 7900 XTX needing an extra incandescent light bulb's worth of power at 354 watts. That does put the 5070 Ti in pretty good standings in terms of energy efficiency, especially compared to older and even slower cards, though even the most efficient card, the MSI Gaming Trio, isn't as efficient as an RTX 5080. And it is worth noting for all of you planning to game at a V-synced 60 FPS, that this does hit the 5070 Ti particularly hard, being one of the least efficient Nvidia cards of the last two generations in this scenario, outside of the RTX 4060 and 5090. But outside of that, these cards are pretty efficient, so how do they handle fan noise? Well, starting at the very bottom is the MSI RTX 5070 Ti Ventus at 40.9 dBA, being one of the loudest cards we've tested. That does make this card even louder than the RTX 5080 and the RTX 5090, so owners of this card may want to look at adjusting the fan curve. The next three loudest cards are substantially quieter at more than 10 decibels less, being the Palit Game Rock, the Galax One-Click OC, and the ASUS Tough. Next up is a grouping of all the alternative BIOSes, with the MSI Gaming Trio and its gaming BIOS being the quietest, and the Palit Game Rock with its quiet BIOS being the loudest, though it's not even a full dBA quieter than the regular BIOS. The two quietest cards, whether they're in their gaming BIOS or in their quiet BIOS, is the MSI Vanguard and MSI Gaming Trio. Both these cards do come in the silent BIOS by default, but even in their gaming BIOS, they would still be the quietest cards at stock. It may then come as a surprise that while the Vanguard does have the best cooler when normalized for noise and for power, the second best cooler is not the Gaming Trio, it's the Palit Game Rock, the massive card with an inconsequential quiet BIOS, so gamers with that card may be able to adjust the fan curve for a better acoustical performance. On the opposite end, the MSI RTX 5070 Ti Ventus does have the worst cooler out of the bunch, though this test was at 35 dBA and not its stock 40 dBA, so at least there's room for improvement. Quickly taking a look at overclocking performance, we were able to get a very similar overclock on all of these cards, roughly netting an extra 10% in performance, though the cards with the higher max power limits do tend to be a little bit better, with the MSI Vanguard having the highest limits and getting the best performance at 350 watts, with our ASUS Tough coming in a very close second while limited to 330 watts. But going back to the question we asked in the intro, did Nvidia accomplish its value goal with this new card? And the answer is yes, no? Well, it kind of depends. At current prices for what the RTX 5080 and 5090 are going for, then yes, Nvidia did deliver a better value with the 5070 Ti, but to be fair, it's kind of hard to deliver a worse value than an RTX 5090 for $5,000. And it's pretty hard to do worse than the RTX 5080 at double its MSRP at $2,000. By those metrics, yeah, the RTX 5070 Ti is a good value, with the MSI RTX 5070 Ti Vanguard coming in at $10 over the MSRP of the RTX 5080 while delivering less performance. Though, to be fair, it does overclock pretty well and has a very good cooler. The Palit Game Rock and the ASUS 5070 Ti Tough are right behind it at $1,000, so technically a savings for basically the same level of performance, though $10 may be worth it to some for a better cooler. The next card up in terms of value is the MSI RTX 5070 Ti Gaming Trio at $980, which is sandwiched between the RTX 4070 Ti and RTX 4080 Super. This card was the most efficient card while gaming in our tests, and was one of the quietest cards overall, but having roughly the same value as the RTX 4080 Super, a card that is typically going to be faster, with the RTX 4080 and RTX 4070 Ti Super being a better value and only a bit slower in the case of the 4070 Ti Super. It does make these more expensive 5070 Ti cards harder to recommend. What's easier to recommend is the MSRP cards, namely the Galax 5070 Ti One-Click OC and the MSI 5070 Ti Ventus. With these cards delivering basically the same performance as their more expensive brethren, it's hard to not recommend these cards over anything else, assuming you can get it at MSRP. Out of these two, the Galax is probably a better deal overall since it does have a better cooler than the Ventus, and the performance levels are about the same. But if you are looking for this level of performance and have a hard time finding one of these cards, the next best thing might just be the RX 7900 XTX, which delivered a similar level of performance in all of our tests outside of ray tracing, and while it doesn't support DLSS, it does have extra VRAM, which may help in some gaming scenarios. If you are rocking something like a 4070 Ti, you probably shouldn't be itching to upgrade, but at $750, the RTX 5070 Ti is a pretty good option. But if you can't find one at that price, you may be better off with a last generation card.